There are rare moments in life when a single second quietly rewrites the future, when nothing explodes and no one applauds, yet everything afterward is divided into before and after. For Ivan Markov, that second arrived on a warm Thursday morning in San Diego, standing inside a tired old garage that smelled of oil and sun-baked metal. For Lila Hart, a 19-year-old who had spent more than a decade bound to a wheelchair, that second came as a faint, almost unbelievable sensation in her foot, touching the ground without pain for the first time since childhood. No one celebrated. No cameras flashed. Just a held breath, trembling hands, and the beginning of something neither of them dared to name yet. Before that moment, there had been years of grief, of long nights staring into darkness, of systems that promised solutions but delivered only disappointment. There had been questions whispered into pillows and shouted silently at the ceiling, asking whether kindness from an ordinary person could ever stand against institutions fortified by money and authority. This is the story of a mechanic forgotten by society, a powerful woman haunted by guilt, and a young girl who had been taught to accept a fate she never chose. It is the story of how compassion succeeded where wealth and prestige had failed, and how everything began with one simple, human question. Evan had not always been a man hidden behind a grease-stained workbench. When he was younger, he dreamed of designing machines that would fly, of becoming an aerospace engineer like his younger brother Adrian. As teenagers, the two of them would sit on the roof of their modest home, watching planes rise from San Diego International Airport, sketching wings and engines with childish certainty that the future belonged to them. That certainty shattered when Evan's wife, Sarah, died during childbirth, leaving him alone with their newborn daughter, Maya. Grief swallowed his ambitions whole. College became impossible. Survival took priority. On the night of Sarah's funeral, Evan sat in silence, Maya asleep against his chest, staring at an acceptance letter and a diploma that suddenly felt like relics from someone else's life. He dropped out of college during his second year and returned to the small garage that had once belonged to his father. When his father passed away from a heart attack not long after, the garage became both his livelihood and his refuge. Every afternoon, while Maya slept nearby, Evan studied old manuals and mechanical textbooks. Not because he believed he would return to school, but because he believed knowledge itself could still matter. Even without validation, that belief would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Few people knew that Evan carried a wound deeper than poverty. 12 years earlier, Adrian, brilliant and full of life, suffered a devastating spinal injury during a scuba diving accident near Loyola Cove. The call from the hospital still echoed in Evan's mind. The doctor's voice detached as he explained that Adrian would never walk again. Evan was only 26 then, already drowning in hospital bills, working endless shifts, raising a child alone. When doctors proposed an experimental surgery with a staggering cost, Evan begged, borrowed, and humiliated himself in ways he never spoke about. It was never enough. Adrian was the one who told him to stop. He smiled through pain and told his brother to take care of Maya to live. 5 years later, complications claimed Adrian's life. In that sterile hospital room, his grip tight around Evan's hand, Adrian made him promise something simple and unbearable, to help others like him and never let them lose hope. That promise became the quiet engine driving Evan forward. After Maya slept, Evan returned to the garage, not to repair engines, but to study the human body as if it were the most delicate machine on Earth. He watched lectures online, read about biomechanics, artificial joints, and weight distribution. He learned how movement was supposed to feel. The garage slowly transformed into a silent laboratory, powered by grief, guilt, and determination. Evan believed that someday, somehow, the chance to keep his promise would come. Across the city, another life unfolded in stark contrast. Victoria Hart lived in glass and ocean views, commanding boardrooms and laboratories as the CEO of BioNova Technologies. Her name carried weight in scientific circles, her face appeared in magazines, and her achievements were celebrated worldwide. Yet none of it erased the memory of an August evening 11 years earlier at Pacific Beach, when her 8-year-old daughter, Lila, had begged her to watch her surf. Victoria had been distracted by a crucial business deal, her eyes fixed on her phone. A sudden wave, a violent impact, and Lila's life changed forever. The diagnosis was brutal. Emergency surgery saved Lila's life, but paralysis followed. From that moment on, Victoria fought fate the only way she knew how, with money and influence. She brought in the best doctors, funded experimental treatments, spared no expense. 11 years passed, filled with surgeries, therapies, and devices hailed as miracles on paper. Yet Lila still lived with pain, learning to smile through it, learning not to complain. The brace she wore cost more than most homes. It was light, advanced, integrated with sensors and artificial intelligence, designed by elite engineers. And still, every step hurt. Victoria heard her daughter cry at night and wondered whether forgiveness could ever be bought. That Thursday morning, Evan was finishing work on an old aircraft engine when the sound of a luxury car purred outside his garage, entirely out of place in the working-class street. Maya sat on the floor nearby, drawing strange machines with wings and gears. When Evan stepped outside, a white Rolls-Royce gleamed in the sunlight like a visitor from another world. From it emerged Layla, moving carefully with the help of rigid braces, and Victoria, immaculate and controlled, her eyes sharp with skepticism. The car had overheated, nothing more. Fate has a way of hiding behind small inconveniences. As Evan inspected the engine, his attention kept drifting toward Lila. He noticed the way she shifted, the way pain crept into her posture despite her attempts to hide it. Finally, unable to ignore what his instinct screamed, he approached her and spoke gently, meeting her at eye level. He asked whether her brace might be too tight. The question stunned her. No one had ever asked it before. Victoria bristled immediately, defending the device and the experts behind it. Evan did not argue. He simply asked permission to look. His hands traced the metal carefully, his expression tightening as understanding formed. He explained, calmly, precisely, how the brace restricted natural movement, how it forced Lila's body to compensate in ways that caused pain. Lila listened, tears forming, realizing that someone finally saw what she had endured in silence. When she asked if he could fix it, Evan hesitated. He saw Adrian's face in her eyes, felt the weight of a promise resurface. He did not promise success. He promised effort. That night, Victoria stood at her window overlooking the ocean, torn between fear and fragile hope. She was terrified of being disappointed again, terrified of what it would mean if this ordinary man succeeded where her empire had failed. But Lila, calm and brave beyond her years, asked her to believe, not in money or credentials, but in someone who genuinely cared. The next morning, Victoria called Evan and agreed on one condition: absolute caution. Evan agreed without hesitation. He carried the brace back into his garage as if it were sacred, while Maya watched quietly, understanding more than he realized. And as Evan began to dismantle the device, guided by intuition and memory, his fate shifted, setting into motion a chain of events that would challenge power, redefine expertise, and test the strength of a promise made long ago. The first night Evan took the brace apart, time slipped past him unnoticed. Bolts and joints lay carefully arranged across the workbench like pieces of a dismantled puzzle, each one holding years of misplaced trust. He studied every angle, every fixed limitation that forced Lila's body into unnatural compensation. Maya fell asleep on a folded blanket nearby, her small chest rising and falling as Evan sketched diagrams beside her. When dawn crept through the garage door, he realized he had not slept at all. Yet exhaustion bowed to something stronger, a sense of responsibility that felt almost sacred. By the following afternoon, the first modified version was ready. Evan had shaved unnecessary weight, adjusted the knee's range, and softened pressure points where metal had pressed mercilessly against skin. When Victoria and Lila returned, the air in the garage tightened with tension. Victoria's posture remained rigid, her eyes never leaving her daughter, while Lila tried to hide her fear behind a quiet smile. Evan explained every change, every risk, never pretending certainty where there was none. When Lila stood, she felt lighter, freer, and for a brief moment hope dared to surface. Then pain tore through the room like glass shattering. Lila screamed and collapsed as blood appeared at her ankle where metal had cut too deep. Victoria rushed forward, terror consuming her restraint, and pulled her daughter into her arms. Her voice shook with fury and fear as she told Evan it was over, that trusting him had been a mistake. Evan stood frozen, hands stained with blood, his mind flashing back to hospital lights and Adrian's labored breathing. As they drove away, Lila turned back once, tears streaking her face, and whispered words that would haunt him through the night, begging him not to give up. The garage felt unbearably silent after they left. Evan sat alone, staring at the ruined brace, replaying every miscalculation. He reached for his phone to call Victoria and surrender, convinced that he had only caused more harm. Maya watched him quietly, sensing the weight pressing down on him. That night, she warmed milk for him with clumsy care and spoke with a seriousness far beyond her years, reminding him of the promise he had made to Adrian. Evan broke down then, holding his daughter as if she were anchoring him to the world. Unbeknownst to him, Maya prayed every night, scribbling desperate hopes into her small diary, asking for her father not to lose another piece of himself. When Evan received a message from Lila apologizing for her mother's anger and telling him she still believed, something shifted inside him. The despair did not vanish, but it hardened into resolve. He turned the lights back on in the garage and reopened his designs, refusing to let the night win. The second prototype emerged hours later, built with aircraft-grade aluminum and lined with medical silicone to protect fragile skin. Evan added shock absorption, convinced this would solve the problem. When Victoria returned, her demeanor was colder, her trust already fractured. Lila, however, smiled bravely. The fitting was slower, more cautious. The first step went well. The second followed. On the third, pain erupted again, sharper and deeper. Victoria screamed, threatening legal action, calling her lawyer on the spot. Evan felt the ground collapse beneath him as Lila clutched his hand and made him promise once more not to quit. That night, Evan sat against the cold concrete wall, whispering apologies to Adrian's memory, convinced he had failed the promise that defined his life. But then clarity struck like lightning. The flaw was not in the materials or the joints themselves. It was balance. Every design he had seen placed control at the knee, but the human body did not move that way. Balance originated at the hips. Without that shift, pain was inevitable. Evan leapt to his feet, heart racing, knowing he had found what everyone else had overlooked. He dismantled everything and began again, this time from nothing. For days, the garage closed its doors. Customers were turned away. Evan spent his savings without hesitation, even the money meant for Maya's schooling, investing it all into materials and testing. He strapped the brace onto himself, fell, adjusted, fell again, and stood back up. Neighbors whispered that grief had finally broken him, but an elderly woman who had known Adrian told them to leave him be, insisting he was saving a life. On the seventh day, Evan finished. The new brace looked unlike anything before it, lighter, fluid, designed around the hip as the true center of balance. He stared at it for a long time, hands trembling, whispering Adrian's name like a prayer. When he finally called Victoria, his voice was steady despite his fear. He asked for one last chance, promising never to trouble her again if he failed. Victoria's silence on the other end felt endless. She spoke of lawsuits, of reputations, of the risk to her daughter. Evan listened without interruption, then spoke simply, reminding her that Lila still believed. Victoria broke down, confessing years of guilt and regret, admitting she had tried to replace love with control. When Evan told her to trust her daughter's hope, something inside her yielded. She agreed to come. But this time, she brought an observer, Dr. Samuel Reed, a respected orthopedic specialist who had followed Lila's case for years. Dr. Reed arrived skeptical, his gaze dismissive as he examined Evan's work. He questioned Evan's lack of credentials and warned of consequences. Evan did not argue. He focused only on Lila. As Dr. Reed studied the brace more closely, his skepticism wavered. The mechanics contradicted medical standards, yet they made undeniable sense. When Evan explained his reasoning, grounded in movement rather than theory, the doctor fell silent, curiosity replacing disdain. The garage filled with a tension so thick it felt tangible as Evan prepared the final fitting. He moved slowly, checking every strap and joint with reverence. Lila stood, gripping her mother's hand, her breath shallow. Seconds passed. Her body did not shake. Then realization dawned across her face. She whispered that she felt no pain. Victoria covered her mouth as tears spilled freely. Dr. Reed leaned closer, eyes wide, witnessing something he could not explain away. Evan encouraged Lila to trust the brace, to let it carry her weight. She shifted, stepped forward, and felt nothing but stability. One step became two, then three. Tears streamed down her face as she walked, sobbing and laughing at once. Victoria collapsed to her knees, years of guilt unraveling in raw emotion. Evan stood frozen, tears carving clean paths through grease on his face as Adrian's promise echoed fulfilled. Dr. Reed whispered in disbelief, recognizing the brilliance of the design even as his world shifted. Lila ran toward her mother, embracing her while standing for the first time in over a decade. Victoria turned to Evan and hugged him tightly, gratitude pouring from her in broken words. Maya ran into the garage, clapping and cheering, her laughter cutting through the tears. The neighbors gathered, drawn by sound and wonder, witnessing something extraordinary unfold before them. In the days that followed, Lila returned daily, training with Evan, each step growing stronger and steadier. The story spread quietly at first, carried by whispers and astonished looks. But triumph attracted attention, and not all of it was kind. One morning, Evan received a thick legal notice from the company that manufactured Lila's original brace, accusing him of violating regulations and demanding he cease his work immediately. His hand shook as he read it, the threat of lawsuits looming large. Soon after, professional associations issued warnings, distancing themselves from Evan's methods. Dr. Reed called Victoria, heavy with conflict, explaining he could not publicly support Evan without risking his career. Victoria understood, but she refused to remain silent. She called a press conference and stood before cameras as Lila walked onto the stage unassisted. The room froze. Victoria spoke with controlled fire, challenging a system that had failed her child while condemning the man who succeeded. Lila spoke next, her voice trembling yet resolute, telling the world that she had been treated like a project instead of a person, until Evan listened. The video spread rapidly, igniting debate and dividing opinion. Evan's life became the center of a storm, caught between compassion and regulation, hailed by some and condemned by others. And as pressure mounted, Evan stood at the edge of another defining choice, one that would determine whether hope could survive scrutiny or be crushed beneath it. The attention that followed did not feel like victory to Evan. It felt heavy, intrusive, and dangerous, as though the fragile thing he had helped bring into existence could be crushed at any moment. Reporters camped outside the garage. Strangers sent messages ranging from gratitude to threats. Maya watched from the doorway as adults argued in raised voices, her small hands clenched, sensing that something precious was being pulled into a world that did not know how to handle it gently. Victoria returned to the garage one evening after the press conference, standing in front of Evan for a long time without speaking. The ocean breeze carried the smell of salt and metal between them. Finally, she offered to hire the best legal team money could buy, insisting she would protect him from what was coming. Evan refused immediately. He told her that if lawyers and money took over, everything would turn into a spectacle, and the people who truly needed help would be too afraid to come forward. His voice was calm, but his resolve was unmovable. Victoria struggled to understand his refusal. To her, power had always meant safety. Evan explained that he was willing to face consequences, but he would not apologize for helping Lila walk. That night, Victoria returned home conflicted, realizing that Evan was prepared to lose everything for a promise he had made to someone no longer alive. It frightened her, but it also awakened something she had buried for years, a respect deeper than admiration. Later that same night, after the garage lights had been dimmed and the noise of the street faded, a stranger appeared. She introduced herself as Dr. Elena Price, a professor of biomedical engineering from Stanford, known quietly within her field as a pioneer who questioned convention. She had seen the footage. She had read the arguments, and she wanted to see the brace with her own eyes. Evan handed it to her without ceremony. For nearly half an hour, she examined it in silence, rotating joints, tracing force pathways, making notes with quick, precise movements. Evan waited, his heart pounding louder with every passing second. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. She told him that what he had built was not an accident or luck. It was instinctive genius, the kind rarely seen because systems were not designed to recognize it. Dr. Price said she would testify for him, publicly if necessary. She would explain to regulators that his design surpassed existing models in safety and effectiveness. Evan was stunned. He warned her that powerful companies would oppose her, that she could damage her career. She dismissed the concern, saying progress was meaningless if fear dictated who was allowed to contribute. For the first time since the legal threats arrived, Evan felt something loosen in his chest. Within weeks, Evan found himself sitting before an FDA review panel, hands clasped tightly, as Dr. Price presented her findings with unwavering clarity. Representatives from major medical device companies argued fiercely, warning of chaos if unlicensed individuals were allowed to innovate. Dr. Price countered every claim with data, mechanical logic, and one undeniable fact: Lila was walking. After hours of debate, testing, and scrutiny, the panel reached a compromise. Evan would be granted a provisional license to continue his work under Dr. Price's supervision while pursuing formal certification. When the letter arrived, Evan read it 3 times before understanding what it meant. He sank into a chair, tears spilling freely as he whispered Adrian's name. Maya hugged him tightly, asking if everything was okay. Evan nodded, unable to speak, knowing that the promise he had carried for so long had not been broken. The months that followed were relentless. Evan studied late into the night, absorbing formal biomedical knowledge while refining his designs during the day. Dr. Price challenged him constantly, pushing him to translate intuition into language regulators could understand. In return, she learned from him how theory met reality inside human bodies. It was not an easy partnership, but it was honest, and both were changed by it. With quiet support from Victoria, Evan opened a small rehabilitation workshop under a new name, Kowalski Mobility. There were no grand openings or glossy advertisements. Word spread instead through patients, families, and physical therapists who had witnessed something rare. People arrived with worn braces, tired eyes, and stories of years spent being told to lower their expectations. Evan greeted each person the same way, kneeling to their level, asking them to show him how they move now, not how textbooks said they should. Lila became a familiar presence there, training daily, her confidence growing with every step. She enrolled in rehabilitation science, determined to help others reclaim what she had almost lost forever. Victoria watched her daughter transform, not just physically, but emotionally. The wheelchair that had once defined Lila's identity gathered dust in a corner. Walks along the beach replaced silent nights filled with regret. Mother and daughter began speaking honestly, healing wounds that no surgery ever could. Public opinion remained divided. Some hailed Evan as a symbol of what humanity had lost in modern medicine. Others warned that his story set a dangerous precedent. Evan avoided interviews, focusing instead on his work. But when a 10-year-old boy named Noah was brought to him, paralyzed since birth, Evan did not hesitate. He told the family he would help, free of charge. The boy's mother cried openly, clutching Evan's hands as if afraid he would disappear. As more patients began to improve, statistics quietly emerged. Dozens regained mobility. Pain levels dropped dramatically. Results spoke louder than arguments ever could. Dr. Price presented these findings at conferences, carefully crediting Evan's work while shielding him from political backlash. Slowly, resistance softened into reluctant curiosity. Evan completed his certification 2 years later, becoming a rare bridge between practical genius and formal recognition. Kowalski Mobility expanded modestly, never losing its grounded atmosphere. The old garage still stood, unchanged, a reminder of where everything had begun. Evan continued repairing engines there on weekends, grounding himself in the familiar rhythm of honest labor. One evening, Evan, Maya, Victoria, and Lila sat together on the sand at Pacific Beach, watching the sun sink into the horizon. Lila stepped into the water, laughing as waves brushed her legs. She cried out in wonder, feeling the cold rush against skin she once thought forever numb. Victoria ran to her, holding her tightly as they both wept, not in sorrow, but release. Maya watched her father quietly, then asked if he was happy. Evan smiled through tears and said, yes, because promises mattered and because hope, once carried with steady hands, could change more than one life. As the sky darkened, Evan felt Adrian's presence not as pain, but as peace, knowing that what had begun in grief had grown into something far larger than he ever imagined. Yet even as peace settled in, Evan understood that his journey was not over. The world he had challenged would not forget easily, and the choices ahead would demand the same courage that had brought him this far. Still, he stood ready, guided by the same belief that had carried him through loss, failure, and doubt, that kindness, when paired with perseverance, could stand against any system and endure. As Kowalski Mobility grew, the pressure around Evan intensified in quieter, more insidious ways. There were no longer shouting reporters or obvious threats, but instead emails filled with polished language and veiled warnings, invitations to meetings that felt more like interrogations, and regulatory reviews that arrived one after another with exhausting precision. Evan learned quickly that changing lives was one thing, but changing systems was another entirely. Each small success seemed to provoke an equal and opposite force, determined to slow him down without ever appearing openly hostile. Victoria watched this from close proximity. She saw Evan arrive at the center before sunrise and leave long after the lights of neighboring buildings had gone dark. She saw how carefully he listened to each patient, how he never rushed their stories, how he treated fear as seriously as pain. And she also saw the toll it took. The man who had once worked alone in a quiet garage now carried the weight of dozens of families who looked at him as their last chance. It reminded her uncomfortably of how she had once placed the same crushing expectations on money and technology, believing they could shoulder everything. One evening, after most patients had left, Victoria stayed behind. She found Evan sitting alone, reviewing charts with red eyes and stiff shoulders. She asked him when he had last rested. He smiled faintly and deflected the question, saying there was still too much to do. Victoria did not argue. Instead, she told him something she had never said aloud before, that watching him had forced her to confront how often power hid behind busyness, how easily responsibility could become an excuse to avoid being present. Evan listened quietly, understanding more than she realized. Lila's progress continued steadily, but what surprised Evan most was not her physical strength. It was her emotional transformation. She no longer moved cautiously, as if waiting for pain to return. She laughed more easily, challenged herself, and spoke openly to new patients about fear, disappointment, and resilience. She never framed her story as a miracle. She framed it as persistence paired with someone willing to truly see her. Families listened to her with a trust they had never given doctors. At the same time, opposition began organizing more formally. Several large medical device companies formed a coalition, publicly emphasizing patient safety while privately pushing for stricter enforcement that would effectively shut Evan down. Articles appeared questioning the ethics of unlicensed innovation, citing hypothetical risks rather than real outcomes. Evan read none of them. Dr. Eleanor Price did, and she warned him that the next phase would not be about evidence, but about influence. The warning proved accurate when Evan received notice of a comprehensive federal audit, one that would examine every device, every patient outcome, and every procedural deviation. The tone was neutral, but the scope was overwhelming. Maya overheard fragments of adult conversations and grew quiet, sensing a familiar tension. One night, she asked Evan if he was going to lose everything. He knelt in front of her, steadying his voice, and told her that even if he did, helping people had never been a mistake. She hugged him tightly, as if committing the words to memory. During the audit, inspectors moved through the center with practiced detachment. They measured, documented, and questioned. Evan answered everything honestly, never embellishing or defending beyond the truth. Dr. Price stood beside him when necessary, translating intuition into formal explanation. The process lasted weeks, draining and relentless. Patients noticed the strain but continued coming, many offering small gestures of support, handwritten notes, food, words of gratitude that reminded Evan why he endured it. One afternoon, a man named Thomas arrived, a former construction worker who had lost mobility after a workplace accident. He had been turned away by multiple clinics due to complexity and cost. Evan examined him carefully, recognizing a familiar pattern of imbalance that could be addressed. When Thomas asked whether the scrutiny surrounding the sender made it risky to proceed, Evan answered honestly, saying risk existed everywhere, but so did choice. Thomas chose to try. Weeks later, he stood for the first time in years. He wept openly, and his story quietly joined many others. As successes accumulated, cracks formed in the opposition's narrative. It became harder to argue against living proof. Still, the coalition persisted, shifting tactics, focusing on Evan personally rather than his work. Anonymous complaints questioned his background, his finances, even his mental stability. Dr. Price warned him that such tactics were meant to exhaust, not to win outright. Evan absorbed the blows silently, but Victoria saw the toll it took. The way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching. Lila confronted her mother one evening, saying she wanted to speak publicly again, not to defend Evan, but to defend patients like her. Victoria hesitated, fearing renewed exposure, but Lila insisted. She said silence had never protected her before. When Lila addressed a small medical ethics forum, she spoke calmly, explaining that safety was not just about protocols, but about listening, adapting, and respecting lived experience. Her words spread, quoted not as emotional appeal, but as reasoned testimony. The audit results finally arrived on a quiet morning. Evan opened the envelope alone in his office, hands steady despite his racing heart. The findings acknowledged minor procedural irregularities, but concluded that patient outcomes demonstrated exceptional benefit and no evidence of harm. Recommendations were made for clearer documentation, not closure. Evan sat down, overwhelmed by relief that felt almost foreign after months of tension. When he told Maya, she smiled and asked if that meant people could keep walking. He nodded, and she hugged him as if the world had just exhaled. That same week, Dr. Eleanor Price proposed something unexpected. She suggested formalizing Evan's approach into a new interdisciplinary framework, one that combined mechanical engineering, clinical oversight, and patient-centered design. It would challenge traditional boundaries, but with institutional backing. It could redefine standards rather than threaten them. Evan hesitated, wary of losing the humanity that defined his work. Dr. Price assured him that frameworks did not have to erase values, only protect them. Victoria supported the idea, offering resources without strings attached. She had learned the cost of control and refused to repeat it. Instead, she asked how she could help without overshadowing. Evan suggested funding scholarships for patients who wanted to train as rehabilitation assistants. Victoria agreed immediately. Lila was among the first to enroll, determined to bridge the gap between patient and practitioner. As months passed, Kowalski Mobility became less of an exception and more of a reference point. Younger doctors visited, curious rather than hostile. Engineers asked questions instead of issuing warnings. Change came slowly, unevenly, but it came. Evan remained cautious, aware that acceptance could reverse as quickly as it appeared. He focused on the work in front of him, one patient, one adjustment, one step at a time. On the anniversary of Adrian's passing, Evan returned alone to the old garage late at night. He stood where it had all begun, surrounded by echoes of loss and effort. He spoke softly, telling his brother about the people who were walking, about Maya's laughter, about Lila's strength. He admitted that he was still afraid sometimes, that responsibility still felt heavy. But he also said that the promise no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a path. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet reckoning happening in that small space. Evan turned off the lights and locked the door, knowing that the journey was far from finished, but also knowing that he no longer walked it alone. Systems could resist, institutions could adapt slowly, but kindness paired with persistence had already proven its power. And whatever came next, Evan was ready to meet it with the same steady hands that had refused to give up when everything told him to stop. The final stretch of Evan's journey did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a single defining victory. Instead, it unfolded quietly in the way lives truly change, through accumulation rather than spectacle. The systems that once resisted him did not collapse, but they bent slowly and reluctantly, reshaping themselves around realities they could no longer deny. Kowalski Mobility became a place people spoke about with reverence, not because it promised miracles, but because it restored dignity. That distinction mattered more to Evan than any recognition ever could. Maya grew up inside that space, not as a bystander but as a witness to resilience. She learned early that strength was not loud, and that success did not always announce itself. She watched her father listen more than he spoke, watched him kneel instead of standing over people, watched how he never treated recovery as a transaction. On weekends, she still helped him in the old garage, handing him tools and asking thoughtful questions that made him pause. She reminded him constantly of why he had begun, anchoring him when responsibility threatened to harden into obligation. Lila's transformation reached far beyond her physical independence. She completed her studies and began working alongside Evan, translating patient fear into language he could address mechanically and emotionally. She became a bridge, proof that recovery did not erase struggle but reframed it into purpose. Patients trusted her immediately, seeing in her the future they were afraid to imagine for themselves. Victoria often watched quietly from a distance, humbled by the woman her daughter had become, understanding at last that letting go had been the greatest act of care she could offer. The interdisciplinary framework Dr. Eleanor Price proposed was eventually adopted by several institutions, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Evan insisted on remaining involved at every level, not to protect his authority, but to safeguard the principles behind the work. He refused offers that promised expansion without intimacy, choosing instead to grow slowly, deliberately, ensuring no patient ever felt like a statistic. His name appeared in journals and conferences, but he rarely attended unless it directly benefited the people he served. Not all battles disappeared. There were still critics, still voices arguing that Evan's path could not be replicated safely, that his story was an exception rather than a model. Evan did not dispute them publicly. He understood that fear often disguised itself as reason. Instead, he let outcomes speak. He let patients walk into rooms where doubt once lived and stand there, breathing, steady, undeniably present. Over time, even the harshest critics softened into cautious observers. One afternoon, A letter arrived from a small coastal hospital requesting Evan's consultation on a complex case. He read it slowly, recognizing the significance not in the request itself, but in the tone. It was not defensive or dismissive. It was open. Evan agreed to help, traveling there quietly, refusing publicity. When the patient took her first steps months later, Evan stood at the back of the room, hands clasped, eyes wet, thinking of Adrian and the chain of moments that had led him there. Victoria underwent her own transformation. She stepped away from her role as CEO, transitioning into an advisory position and dedicating her time to initiatives focused on ethical innovation. She spoke openly about her past, about how ambition without presence had cost her years she could never reclaim. Her honesty surprised many and inspired others. She and Lila walked together often along Pacific Beach, their conversations no longer burdened by silence or regret. The ocean no longer represented loss. It represented continuity. On a quiet evening, years after the first brace lay dismantled on a grease-stained workbench, Evan gathered his small team and family in the old garage. The building remained unchanged, its cracked walls and familiar smells grounding him. He placed a simple plaque near the workbench, dedicating the space to Adrian. There were no speeches, just silence, shared and understood. Evan felt peace settle in him, not as an absence of pain, but as acceptance of its place in his story. Maya asked him later if he ever wished things had been easier. Evan considered the question carefully before answering. He told her that ease rarely taught people who they were meant to become. He told her that promises mattered only when they cost something, and that keeping them shaped the world in ways no one could predict. Maya nodded, absorbing the words not as a lesson, but as truth she would carry forward. Kowalski Mobility continued its work quietly, helping hundreds reclaim movement, confidence, and autonomy. Some outcomes were dramatic. Others were subtle, a reduction in pain, a regained independence, a smile where despair once lived. Evan valued them all equally. He knew that walking was not the only measure of progress. Sometimes, the greatest victory was restoring belief. Years later, on a California evening painted gold by the setting sun, Evan stood with Maya, Lila, and Victoria on the shoreline. Lila stepped into the water, steady and unafraid, laughing as waves washed over her legs. Maya ran ahead, splashing, her laughter echoing across the beach. Victoria watched them both, tears in her eyes, gratitude softening her features. Evan stood back, hands in his pockets, artful in a way he had never known was possible. Maya asked him if he would ever stop doing what he did. Evan smiled and shook his head gently. He said that as long as there were people told to accept less than they deserved, there would be work worth doing. He said that hope was not something you finished delivering. It was something you carried forward, one person at a time. As the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, Evan felt Adrian's presence not as memory, but as legacy. The promise he had made no longer felt heavy. It felt fulfilled and alive, moving through every step taken by those he had helped. The world had not changed all at once, but it had shifted enough to prove something enduring. That ordinary hands, guided by compassion and persistence, could do what money and power alone never could. And so, the story did not end with applause or finality. It continued quietly, in workshops and hallways, in first steps and steady breaths, in people choosing not to give up. It continued in the simplest and most profound truth Evan had ever learned. That kindness, when paired with courage, could teach the world how to walk forward again.